Welcome to another episode of Grad Chat from PhD Balance, where we talk about topics of grad school beyond academic research and that may be more difficult to talk about in our day-to-day. My name is Fay Lin, and I'm a PhD candidate in biochemistry at UCLA. If you like what you see here, check out the PhD Balance YouTube channel for more grad chats, and don't forget to subscribe for notifications about when we go live. So, our topic today is managing finances during your PhD, and I'm excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Emily Roberts. Emily is an expert in personal finance for graduate students and early career PhDs. She started her business, Personal Finance for PhDs, shortly after defending her PhD in biomedical engineering from Duke in 2014. Emily now gives webinars for universities, hosts a podcast, coaches individuals and small groups, creates courses and workshops, and runs a community as part of this business. So you can find Personal Finance for PhDs on their social media and website in our description below this video. So welcome, Emily. I'm so excited to talk to you. How are you doing today?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Faye, and PhD Balance. I'm really delighted to be with you. I'm doing really well. I'm also in Southern California, so we are enjoying an absolutely gorgeous day today. I've already been outside. It's been wonderful.
Ooh, it is like it's in the 80s this weekend. I forgot to ask you, where are you right now geographically?
I'm in Orange County.
Oh, awesome. I'm in where am I? Los Angeles, near UCLA. Woo, go UCLA. So it is like an incredible day. Happy for many reasons, and here we are to talk about some important topics in finances. So I think what is pretty documented is that it can be very difficult to manage your finances as a PhD student when arguably they stipends could be higher, right?
Yeah,
So we have a
absolutely.
list of yeah, we have a list of questions here that go into various topics from how to budget, how to cover your taxes, how to deal with various expenses that might be different for a grad student compared to other sorts of professions. So if we just want to jump in right here, this first question we have says, living off a stipend is challenging. How can I manage, and where are good areas of spending to cut?
Yes. And this question is already phrased so interestingly because there's kind of two sides to making your budget balance. There's earning more and there's spending less if it doesn't balance currently. And this person has already zeroed in on spending less, which actually is exactly what I did during graduate school as well. I was very focused on like frugality and managing a budget and so forth. But I'll answer the question, but I just want to point out that there's another side to that equation that is available for not all, but many graduate students have the possibility of increasing their income in a variety of ways. So we won't touch on that for now, but in terms of decreasing expenses, um, I, I approach this in a couple different ways, but one of the ones that I really like is by thinking about your largest expenses first. If you think about like the Pareto principle, like the 80-20 rule, 80% of your results are going to come from 20% of your effort. And so if you apply that to like your budget and your expenses, it makes the most sense to concentrate on your largest expenses first when you're looking for cuts, because there's the most potential room for cuts in those largest expenses. So for most Americans and PhD students, usually as well, that's housing, transportation, and food. Those are the three biggest expenses in most people's budgets. So while it is very difficult to think about how to reduce your housing expense, it might involve moving. It might involve some sacrifice that you maybe in the past decided you weren't willing to make, but maybe you're reevaluating that. Similarly with a car, usually that's because of a car loan if it's a high, expense in that area. Maybe switching up the car that you have. It's very daunting to think about these things and to try to plan them and figure out how you're going to execute them. But the thing is that if you do manage to reduce your housing expense, if you manage to have a different car with either no car loan or lower car loan, if you do pull it off, that's money back in your pocket every single month without you having to put in any more effort. So that's why I love to think about those large, big, the big fixed expenses first. And then once you're settled on those, you are spending the amount of money that you want to on those, then trickling down to those like smaller expenses, more variable expenses. Frankly, because, trying to make a cut, like, oh, I'm just going to stop, buying coffee out, or I'm going to stop shopping on Amazon or other, tactics that you might try. One, they may not be that effective because they're smaller expenses to begin with. And two, it's usually very, very difficult to sustain that over time. Like psychologically, yeah, maybe you can do it for a month or two, but it's really difficult to keep it up long term unless you've really instituted a habit change in your life. So that's why I like to think about those large fixed expenses first, because it does not take any additional willpower on an ongoing basis to, sustain that cut that you've made.
I think that's a great piece of advice and something that I haven't really thought of. I really relate to this idea that for some of these more little changes in your finances, that it's hard to stick with it, but when you're focusing on more bigger things, I think setting up a system makes it easier to stick with it, right? And I think that's so important because a lot of this budgeting from my experiences as a grad student has to deal with thinking long term, right? And thinking about how something that is sustainable to complete long term in the time that I am a PhD student for 5, 6, or however many years. That's a great tip that I think I'm going to reflect a little bit more on as well in my own budgeting.
Yeah, the
And
thing, well,
yeah,
I what
no,
I
keep
what
going.
I like
Yeah.
about that answer is that you there's no, I don't want to say no. The super quick solutions within personal finance, again, get you small results, small scale results. The solutions and the changes that you make that take planning, that take forethought, that take deep understanding of what your own desires are for your life, those are the ones that are really going to move the needle in the long term. And things like, the lattes, right? The latte factor, like cutting out, expensive coffee or anything else. Sometimes those little things are the ones that kind of give you a little dose of pleasure in your day, which might otherwise be, frankly, in graduate school, a little bit bleak, a little bit monotonous. Maybe you need that little, jolt of joy. That's coming through whatever that small, pleasures that you've decided to have. And if it's really something that brings a lot of value to your life and, not really a huge effect on your budget, then try to do what you can to keep it. And again, reevaluate those larger expenses that are, yes, more difficult to change. It takes a little bit longer term thinking, but can be, a bigger lever.
I love it. I love it. I think this also goes into our next question here, where you mentioned that there are so many diverse ways in which we can budget, whether it's big things or little things. And I think another factor to that is also the area that you live in and how finances relate to that particular area. So this question here says, do you have advice on how to manage your budget when you live in an expensive area?
Yeah, this is, I mean, okay, I feel for grad students everywhere, but I really, really feel for graduate students like you who are living in a high cost of living area. I didn't experience that during my PhD. I lived in a medium cost of living area. And now that I've had a little bit of a wider view of grad student experiences, during that time, it's those high cost of living areas that are really, really tough because maybe the stipend is higher, but it's not that much higher to make up for the difference in cost of living between, that stipend and one you might get at a Duke or one you might get at a Purdue, for example. So it doesn't vary as much as it should if it were just based on cost of living and living wages and so forth. So I want to acknowledge that it's a really, really tough problem. But the answer really kind of goes back to the same principles of like, get those large fixed expenses as low as you can. I mean, I would say, so maybe you've heard the rule of thumb that like you shouldn't spend more than, it kind of varies, but maybe 30% of your take home pay on your housing. That's like a common rule of thumb. Very, very common for graduate students in high cost of living areas to violate that. They might be up at 40, 50 or more percent of their income being spent just on rent. And so that's tough. You know that your budget's going to be really tight when you're spending that fraction of it just on your basic housing. But I would say, for example, if you know that you're above that 30% figure and you're not yet living with a roommate, yeah, it's probably the best thing to do to get a roommate. Now, of course, there will always be people who say like, no, my 100% value is I have to live alone. I'm willing to sacrifice anything else. And that's cool. Like, that about yourself, that about your budget. You're going to make those sacrifices in other areas. But yeah, living with a roommate, obviously, getting into subsidized housing, sometimes these universities and higher cost of living areas do have limited subsidized housing available for students. And whatever wait list you need to be on those wait lists because I'm positive that it will help you out. Yeah, so I'm kind of focusing on housing, but then the other thing is transportation. I listed that as another top expense, but if you live in an urban area, it doesn't have to necessarily. Like maybe you can live without a car, depending on the city, of course. And subbing I don't have my own car for I just Uber everywhere is not like a frugal substitution necessarily, but obviously using public transport and walking and biking, doing all those great things. I'm saying this, of course, in the middle of COVID, and public transport is not probably very favorable to be used right now, but yeah, these are some options that you can think about. So, and then, yeah, food I said is the third one, and eating out, it's a very common thing for graduate students to do. I like a rule that I implemented for myself during graduate school, which is that I only ate out for social occasions. So if I was invited with like a group of people, I would do that. But I at the beginning of grad school noticed I was eating out a lot for convenience and noticed the effect that it was having on my spending, and just decided to, as a rule for myself, I just don't eat out for convenience. It's only for social occasions. So yeah, focusing on those three big ones. But the housing is the biggest rock in the middle of all of that. So if you can really get that dialed in, and I've featured a few stories on my podcast, many stories actually, of people living in higher cost of living areas, including a student at UCLA, for example, who have, cracked the housing nut in one way or another. And sometimes it involves just a lot of patience, diligence, research, not doing the easy thing to look for housing, but going out of your way to, search in a more creative way, and, holding on to a good value once you find it.
Yeah, when you were talking about housing costs, where I'm a grad student in LA, and my rent is indeed around 40 to 50% of my stipend. And that is definitely one of the things that is on my mind when I think about finances as a PhD student in LA. And I think I really like how you brought up this concept of diligence, doing your homework, because it is something that may have to take a lot of thought managing finances as a PhD student. And I wanted to also shift gears a little and talk about some of these next questions here that we have about taxes, which for grad students may be very different in comparison to other professions, and might also take more of that homework and diligence, like you were mentioning. So, this first question here says, what do grad students who receive fellowships need to watch out for with respect to their income tax?
Yes. So I'm really excited to talk about this topic. And this is a great time of year for it. We're entering tax season, hasn't quite started yet. So fellowship recipients, fellowship and training grant recipients, I kind of group together. I call that kind of income awarded income. So I have these two like categories, awarded income and employee income. So for your stipend as a graduate student, the typical language the universities use is if you're on an assistantship, TARA, graduate assistantship, you're typically an employee of the university. Whereas if you're on fellowship or on a training grant, you're typically not an employee, or at least not with respect to that portion of your income. And so I call that awarded income. But the real way you tell is whether or not you receive a W-2 at tax time. So if you're an employee, you're going to receive that W-2 just like all employees in the US do. If you don't receive a W-2 for your stipend, for example, then you're on this awarded income, side of the equation. So people with fellowship income with awarded income need to watch out, because most universities don't withhold income tax on behalf of those non-employees. They only do it for employees. That's not universally true. There are a few exceptions, but most places they don't do that withholding for non-employees. So the thing to watch out for is when you receive a paycheck as an employee, it would be your net income, your after-tax income. Your tax withholding would have already happened. If you're a fellow not having income tax withheld, you're receiving 100% of your pay. Then the backside of that is you are responsible for paying your income tax to the IRS. Now, depending on how much awarded income you have in the calendar year, you might be able to just pay all your tax due when you file your tax return each spring. But more likely, if you're on fellowship for an entire calendar year, I'm betting that the IRS is going to require you to file estimated tax, quarterly estimated tax. And so what that means is that basically instead of the IRS receiving some money that your employer sends on your behalf, every month or biweekly or whatever the schedule is, you have to actually make those payments possibly quarterly. So the deadlines are mid-April, mid-June, mid-September, and mid-January. Actually, we just had a deadline yesterday, January 15th, for the fourth quarter of 2020. So basically any income, this awarded type income that doesn't have income tax withheld you receive during that quarter, you may end up, needing to make a payment just after that quarter. So the best practice here is to kind of calculate this all out, figure out how much tax you're going to owe generally for the year, and set aside a fraction of every one of those paychecks into, I suggest, a dedicated savings account to then pull from to pay quarterly or pay at the end of the year. And I really love when I have an opportunity to talk about this, because I talk with so many grad students and postdocs every tax season who are like, I've never paid income tax in my 3 years that I've been in graduate school. I had no idea this was something I was responsible for. Or, oh my gosh, it's the end of the year. I should have been paying estimated tax all year. What do I do now? And so it's a really, really tough situation to be in if you don't realize early on that that's the case. So I love getting to talk about this. So if you just switched on to fellowship in the fall, start doing this self-withholding kind of thing, and stay on top of those income tax payments. If you want more information about this, because if it applies to you, I'm betting you're going to want more than just 2 minutes of explanation. My website is a great place to go to, pfforphds.com/tax. And that's the tax center. And you'll find an article there on quarterly estimated tax, and also links. I have a workshop on quarterly estimated tax, for example, that goes on sort of year round for people, because they switch on to fellowship kind of all year round. So yeah, that's where you can go for more information. But I'll ask you, Fay, have you encountered this during graduate school?
Oh, yes. Okay. So when you were speaking about, well, okay, I'll speak about my personal experiences where I've transitioned either between having a fellowship or being funded by my lab directly or being funded by my department when I was TAing, et cetera. There's a lot of switching in your funding sources, and how you handle tax is constantly changing depending on where your funds come from. And it definitely was very or a learning curve for me when I was on fellowship and I realized, oh, my taxes are no longer being withheld, right? And it took me a bit to realize that was happening, and then have to do the homework to be like, okay, now how do I maybe adjust my budgeting? Exactly how much tax am I going to have to pay, et cetera. So I think that is a common experience when I talk to other grad students, just switching the source of your income and how you handle taxes when you are constantly switching the source of income. So I don't know, in your interactions with grad students, Emily, is that also a common thing you hear? Just a constant, depending on where the source is, how you handle taxes is differently. And it's you have to learn a whole new way of budgeting or how to pay your taxes depending on the source. Do you have
Yeah.
any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's exactly what you said. It's so common. And also when you do these mid-year switches, like over the summer or the fall or whatever, I said earlier, well, if you receive a W-2, then you're an employee. Well, if you switch mid-year, that W-2 isn't expected for another 6 months or whatever. So you kind of have to be proactive. If you're not really sure, if you haven't received a letter, an email, something that's really clear about what is the source of this funding, you might need to ask a couple questions of your advisor, of, the departmental admin assistant or whatever, to figure out what this source is. Because I know when I was in graduate school, I felt like someone on fellowship versus someone on a research assistantship were sort of functionally interchangeable, right? On a day-to-day basis. I wasn't even sure sometimes where my funding was coming from, because it's just yeah, I received my stipend. Okay, I guess I'm good. So yeah, it can be very, perplexing. And so this is actually a tip for if there are any prospective graduate students watching who haven't yet committed to this journey. I think finding out, from your offer letter really clearly for your first year and all your subsequent years, where's this funding going to come from? Because, for instance, in the biological sciences, it's very common to be on a training grant first 1 or 2 years, then maybe you're funded by your lab, or maybe you win a fellowship, either internal or external. And like you said, it can switch back and forth. I actually just recorded a podcast interview with someone who said, it's actually going to be published on Monday, but literally it felt like every single month her funding was different, because she would win small awards or get travel stipends. And it varied so much. So yeah, switching up probably about once per year is a pretty common experience.
It's also so validating to hear that too, because I think when you're first starting out in grad school, especially for me, as someone who went straight from undergrad, where the concept of making money, or for me at least, having a paycheck, paying taxes, it's still something I'm still learning. I think it can be very confusing to first find out as a grad student that there are different types of funds and that it is going to be different recognizing that it is going to be an obstacle to face, I think was itself, I think, a surprise before I entered grad school. So it's really nice to have these chats where we do have the space to kind of put these, um, or I guess I want to call it a struggle, or just some of the parts of grad school life up front and share with people and have these conversations.
Yeah, I think another element in here is, like, for instance, I think this is also common. Like when I was in college, my parents helped me with the tax returns that I had to do. Like I don't even think I ever paid any tax, but I had to file and get money back or whatever. But then once you hit this grad school thing with like the awarded income and you have the money that goes towards paying your tuition and your fees and everything, and it's so vastly different than the undergrad world that whoever you were going to for help before, like your parents, or maybe I hear this a lot as well, your parents, tax person, they suddenly have no idea how to deal with this. And if they're good, they're going to slow down and say, I'm not sure about this. Maybe you need to look into it more yourself. And then you find me. If they're not good, they're going to forge ahead with the knowledge that they have without investigating what the differences really are. And you can end up with inaccurate tax returns. I've spoken with graduate students who have gone years without ever paying income tax on a fellowship because some person of authority told them that was the way to do things, which is usually not correct. Other way around, the university I went to, Duke, actually uses this really strange tax form that gets confused with self-employment income. So some of my peers were paying self-employment tax, which is a very, very high tax rate, on their fellowship income. And so again, for years, they're massively overpaying their taxes because, again, someone in authority told them this was the right way to do things without properly investigating it. So I've seen it go both ways. I don't want you to go to either extreme. I want you to pay the right amount of tax, not more, not less, exactly right. So that's kind of that's my mission every tax season, is like accurate tax returns for grad students.
Yeah, it's so great to talk to you, Emily, and have someone who has gone through the PhD experience, who knows the process, and who is familiar with finances as a PhD to offer these resources. Because, like you said, I think that's something that I also ran into as I was starting out trying to navigate what exactly taxes and all this meant, was finding someone who did understand the specific context. Right. So please check out like Emily's information in the description below if you do want to get more of her resources, because it is really awesome to have someone who is very attuned to what finances in a PhD role is like. And I think with that, one of the other questions here is, what is the first step all grad students need to take when they start preparing their tax returns? If you want to give some tips for how to start out.
Yeah. This is a great time of year for it too. A lot of people have learned file their tax returns in January so they can get that refund. This year, some people are getting their stimulus checks, if they didn't get it earlier in the year. It's a great time of year for this. So the tip is kind of slow down, like I said earlier. Don't forge ahead and jump into tax software with your forms in front of you, never having considered what they mean. So the basic tip is that you need to really understand all your sources of income as a graduate student, as a funded graduate student, and also all the expenses that you've had related to your education that might potentially be of benefit to you on your tax return, depending on how things work out. So that could mean, so we all know about the stipends, right? The stipend comes to your bank account. You're aware that you're receiving a stipend. Most people think, oh, maybe I need to pay income tax on that. What people don't think about as much is the funding behind the scenes, right? The money that goes towards paying your tuition, the money that goes towards paying your health insurance, the money goes towards paying your fees. That money is also income to you during the year. The good news is that you have a bunch of expenses, the tuition, the fees, the health insurance, the blah, 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 everything, that could potentially either reduce your taxable income or reduce your ultimate tax due. So the tip is slow down and really look at, what are all of my income sources? What are all of my expenses? And then to decide which education tax benefit is the best one to, give you the lowest tax liability as a combination of all these things. So that's a really brief answer because I teach this in detail. So I have a workshop on preparing tax returns for funded graduate students. If you're interested in that, it's at pfforphds.com/tax workshop. And it's like, I don't know, an hour or so of like video content and like worksheets and live calls so that we can get a lot more in depth into this. And you will if you want to dive into it with me. But yeah, that's the first step. And then the other kind of tip in there is universities are not very consistent in what tax forms they send out or don't send out. As I said earlier, if you're an employee, you'll get a W-2, but if you're not an employee, there's the Form 1098T you may or may not receive. There's the Form 1099 Miss, which a few universities, not many, use. There's courtesy letters, which are not official tax forms, which is letters that say this is how much money we gave you. And then there's no communication whatsoever. A lot of universities go that route, no communication whatsoever regarding this awarded income that I mentioned earlier. So it's hard to make a broad generalization. It's very like individual depending on what forms you do or don't receive and all sorts of other things. But yeah, that's a start. Just slow down, look at all of the numbers.
There are so many forms. I remember being overwhelmed with all these different forms when I was starting out and trying to navigate everything. And let's see, we do have additional questions here about taxes because taxes are indeed confusing as a grad student. And it says, do international students need to pay the same taxes as domestic students? Are there any other tax/income things international students need to watch out for?
Yes. So, as much as I said the domestic student thing was complicated, I was speaking about US citizens and residents before. If you're a non resident, things go up another level. Well, first of all, you have to figure out, are you a non resident or are you a resident for tax purposes? And that can switch before you get a green card. That's based on the amount of time that you're in the country, not necessarily whether or not you have a permanent residency officially yet. So, that's the first step is what's your status? After that, it really depends. There's another area that gets really complicated. So it depends on the type of income that you have, whether it's, again, W-2 or it's awarded income. And where did that awarded income come from? Was it from a source in the US? Was it from a source in your home country? There are different tax answers, depending on that. What's the tax treaty that's in place between the US and your home country, if any? The tax treaty can give you some benefits like, hey, this certain type of income is not taxable for the first 2 years you're in the United States, for example. So you have to look at that tax treaty and figure out whether or not, if it applies to you and your income and so forth. One of the really disappointing things that happened with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed at the end of 2017 was that it increased the standard deduction by quite a lot. And then it also eliminated the exemptions that were in place before that. So you used to be able to take like one exemption for yourself. If you had other family members, you could do that. Instead, it's all lumped into this big standard deduction. International students got hit really hard with that because they, in most, but not all cases, can't take the standard deduction. They have to itemize their deductions. And then they lost these exemptions that they were able to take. So when you ask, like, is an international student paying the same tax as someone in the United States? It depends on all those factors that I just listed. And actually, I'm really intensely interested in providing more content for international students the way that I do for domestic students. So please subscribe to my mailing list, follow along, pforphds.com/subscribe, because I'm planning on producing a lot more content just in the next month, actually, for those international students. So it's something I'm looking to diving into more.
Awesome. 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 You have so many great resources. And I think another question we have here says, what is the biggest hurdle grad students need to overcome to achieve financial success in grad school?
Yeah, actually, the answer to this goes back to something you brought up earlier, which was, you went directly from undergrad to grad school and you were kind of having to learn all these things basically about both being a grad student and kind of being an adult, I'm assuming, really treating yourself as an adult for the first time. If you were a traditional kind of college student before that point, I was a traditional college student before entering graduate school. So the biggest thing that I think graduate students have to overcome, yes, the stipends are low. Yes, the cost of living is high. Yes, the taxes are complicated. Yes, you're stressed because you have a lot of, time that you need to devote to your studies. But all those things are going to be in place for everyone. What you can change or what you can alter is the way that you approach things and your mindset towards your finances. So my encouragement is that you do not think of yourself as a student. So yes, you are a student. Technically, you're a student. But I would rather you think about yourself as a developing professional, emerging researcher, any other term that you would like to use other than student, because I think that, when you think of yourself as a student, you kind of let yourself off you could, not everyone does this, but you might let yourself off the hook for things like, well, I don't need to care about my finances while I'm in graduate school because I'm still a student and I'm going to worry about that when I'm done. Same thing for your physical and mental health, same thing for your relationships, same thing for professional development. Having that student label has the potential for you to not really hold yourself to a higher standard in all these other, non-research, non-school areas of your life. So that's what I would say. Don't think of yourself as a student. And so if you have been telling yourself, I'll worry about finances later, I think that you should start now. There's no better time to start working on something like finances than the present. And yes, things are going to be limited and difficult because of your low stipend, but that doesn't mean there's nothing you can do. There's absolutely, no matter what financial situation they're in, there's some step that you can take tactically to improve it. But it all comes back to what's your mindset. Do you actually feel motivated to do that? Or do you want to just keep on the way you have been before, maybe considering yourself a student?
Yeah, no, that really hit home for me when you were talking about thinking about yourself as a student, when you are doing this PhD, because I think this is a very common conversation that I've seen happening, that PhD students are considered students when it's convenient and employees when it's convenient. And that does feed into how, as the person going through the PhD, how we see ourselves. And even when I was first applying to grad school, my vision of a PhD was more maybe the same as undergrad, right? I mean, I can do all this research about what a PhD entails, but until you get there, you really see how much of it is definitely not like undergrad, where, you take classes in the beginning, but then transition more into full-time research afterwards, into more uh, job, hours of a job kind of work. So I think that definitely plays a lot into how we think about finances, think of ourselves as young professionals, because we are young professionals. And even though we are in this PhD program, how we think about our role as a student is so interesting, and it's really cool that you brought that up.
I'd like to add something more if you don't mind. I draw a big financial distinction between undergrads and, generally speaking, professional students. So people who are paying to be at a university versus people who are getting paid to be at a university. So graduate students and postdocs, kind of on the other side of that division. Of course, some graduate students do take out debt, and there's some mix and match on those margins. Some undergrads receive enough scholarships that they're paid to be there, but there's a general division between those two groups. And so it's not even like necessarily differentiating yourself financially and in other respects from undergrads, but also maybe from your friends in the business school and from your friends in the med school and from your friends in pharmacy or whatever these other areas are, because it is a completely different financial situation. Their debt, not in all cases, but in many cases, is justified by the salaries that they're going to receive on the other side of getting those degrees. PhDs have no such guaranteed prospects, right? Some people do very well financially on the other side of the PhD. Some people do not career-wise. So you have to be, I think, more cautious in your spending and so forth than, your peers in those professional schools.
Definitely. It's a very specific type of space to be in, a PhD education and how to handle finances. And we are running out of time for this grad chat, but Emily, if there's anything in addition that you want to say to this audience, or anything you feel is important to include, anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've hit a lot of highlights already, so I'm really happy with this. I would say the only other thing I'd like to add is sometimes people ask me, what's the first thing that I should do when I want to get control of my finances, turn the ship around? What's the very first thing I should do? And my answer to that is track your expenses, not budgeting, just tracking, just observing, whether that's using an app, software, writing it down on a piece of paper, something in your phone, whatever. Any method is fine, but just start to track and you'll start to see patterns. You'll automatically start to change your behavior because I'm going to have to write this down later. It's going to show up in my Mint account or whatever it is. You'll automatically start to change your behavior. So that's the first suggestion. Actually, if you want 5 quick things you can do to improve your finances today, I mentioned earlier subscribing to my mailing list, pfforphds.com/subscribe. You'll get a PDF of 5 quick actions you can take to give you quick wins in your finances if you sign up through that link.
Awesome. Awesome. This was such an informative chat that I wish I saw when I was starting out in grad school. Thank you so much for being here today with us, Emily. So this has been Grad Chat from PhD Balance, where we talk about topics of grad school outside of the academic research. So we go live every Saturday, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. And if you did like what you see here, subscribe to our YouTube channel and get notifications for when we go live. So until next time, we'll see you all later. Bye.